For the last 50 years, the conversation about illegal drugs has almost always been about morality, about right versus wrong. We're going to try something different here. Let's set the moral debate aside for a moment and instead just do the math. Let's follow the money and audit the results.
So that brings us to the big, kind of provocative question we have to ask. After half a century of taking a very specific, very tough approach, did it actually work? What were the results?
The way we're going to frame this whole explainer is pretty simple. We're not here to judge the policy on its good intentions. We're judging it on its results. Think of this as a public policy audit, and it's all focused on one question. Was it a good investment? We're going to look at the whole tough-on-drugs strategy that kicked off back in the late 1960s as exactly that, a massive 50-year-long public experiment. And, like any good experiment, you have to look at the data to see if the hypothesis was right.
Now, before we dive into the numbers, just a quick heads up about the data. Does a perfect, pristine 50-year data set exist for this? Of course not. That's not how the real world works. But we don't really need one. We can look at the trends, the patterns, the overall shapes in the data, and still ask the most important question. Did this strategy actually do what it promised to do?
You see, every major policy starts with an expectation, a theory about what's supposed to happen. And the tough approach to drugs was no different. It was built on a really specific idea about how drug use grows and how it spreads through society. The tough-on-drugs policy was really based on one of two big ideas. The first is what you might call the moral panic view. It sees drug use spreading like a virus, an infection that's growing exponentially and needs to be stamped out with aggressive force. The other view, the economic one, sees it acting more like a market. It has a period of rapid growth, then it stabilizes, and it rises and falls based on things like poverty and social conditions.
And that right there is the crucial question. After 5 decades of policy that was pretty much based on that first theory, the virus theory, which pattern did we actually end up seeing in the real world? And here it is, the core finding of the whole analysis. The data just doesn't back it up. There's no clear evidence that escalating the punishments and tightening the laws actually shrunk the problem. For all the promises, that big reduction in drug use, it never really showed up in the numbers.
So this begs the question, if the data looks bad, does that automatically mean the policy was a total failure? Well, not always. There's a really common trap that we all fall into when we're judging new policies, and it's super important to understand it.
This quote just nails the problem. See, sometimes when a new policy drags a hidden behavior out into the open, the numbers can spike at first, and we panic. We see that spike and call it a failure, but often it's just a transition effect. It's the system adjusting. The problem is, we're not very good at telling the difference.
A perfect example of this actually happened in the UK back in the early 90s. They brought in this policy to make court fines proportional to your income. The goal was to make things fairer. But what happened? A couple of really wealthy people got hit with these enormous, headline-grabbing fines. The whole policy got judged on these crazy outliers, not on whether it was working overall. And just like that, it was scrapped.
So, the big takeaway here is that our knee-jerk reaction to those initial, messy-looking numbers can make us ditch a new idea before it even gets a real shot. And that's a key lesson to keep in your back pocket when we talk about what could happen next.
Okay, so if the policy didn't deliver the reduction in drug use that it promised, what did it deliver? Well, this brings us to the financial heart of this entire explainer, the absolutely mind-boggling cost of this 50-year experiment. So let's start with the consistent year-in, year-out cost. For the last 20 years or so, where we have really solid data, the price tag for society has been shockingly stable and shockingly high. £20 billion every single year. That's the estimated annual social and economic cost, and a huge chunk of that is driven by drug-related crime. That figure has just been stuck there, year after year, for 2 decades.
Okay, so now let's zoom out. If that's the annual bill in recent times, what does the total tab look like since this whole experiment kicked off back in the late 1960s?
Brace yourself. We're talking about somewhere between £500 billion and £1 trillion. That's the conservative estimate for the total public cost. It's a number so huge it's almost impossible to even wrap your head around.
This table really puts that number into stark relief. The source material asks this fascinating what-if question. What if, instead of prohibition, the state had just decided to manage the problem? Maybe even cover the supply costs for the most high-risk users. The estimated bill would have been around £150 billion. The potential net savings? Somewhere between £350 and £850 billion. It's just a staggering difference.
So, after looking at the expectations, the reality, and those jaw-dropping costs, we circle right back to the central strategic question. What is the real goal of our drug policy? Is it simply to condemn a behavior, or is it to intelligently manage its consequences?
So let's just recap. What did this 50-year experiment actually deliver? Well, it didn't get rid of demand, it definitely didn't collapse the supply chains, and it sure didn't stop criminal networks from making a fortune. What it did do was lock the government into decades of massive spending, while the actual harm from drugs seemed to track things like inequality and despair way more closely than it tracked the severity of the punishment.
And this is the final thought we're left with. After 50 years and up to £1 trillion spent, if a certain behavior just keeps persisting, then how should we measure success? Is it about how loudly we can shout our disapproval, or is it about how intelligently and how cost-effectively we can manage the real-world result?